Put it in slideshow mode. Yep, your beauty. So I'm going to let the public in now, and then at 1 minute after, at 31, the webcast will start. Here we go, going live now.
Hold on a second, wait, I can't, this took over my whole screen. Hi, my name is Jamie Lombardi, and it is my pleasure to moderate our roundtable today. We will be talking about fear, confidence, and risk in the context of our global pandemic. It is interesting to wonder about fear in this context of a health crisis, whether it is irrational, instrumentalized, pure survival instinct, or even positively mobilizing effect, and how it influences the construction of our societies. Fear questions in particular the conception of the state, which embodies unity and protection. This contract of submission mentioned by Hobbes, which entails consent to the sovereign in exchange for security, how to accept this risk-taking and maintain this contract of confidence in the face of a weakened political response, which fails to understand and respond to the crisis of our time. Our first panelist today is Tanella Boni. She is an Ivorian writer, philosopher, and university professor. Her poems and philosophical essays focus in particular on how women and men can live as humans and maintain their dignity in the face of violence. Her book on what are the women of Africa going through is about the place of women in Africa, feminism, and strategies of resistance and women's revolt. In 2005, she won the Amadou Karumo Prize for her novel, Matins de Couvre-feu, Curfew Mornings, my apologies for mispronouncing that. And in June 2009, she received the Antonio Vicaro International Poetry Prize at the 27th Poetry Market. Tanella, I open it to you. Tanella, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay.
Oui, je suis là. Merci. Je voudrais d'abord remercier l'UNESCO de m'avoir invité à prendre la parole à l'occasion de la Journée mondiale de la philosophie sur un sujet qui nous concerne tous. Alors, je cherche à démarrer ma vidéo.
Votre vidéo est démarrée.
Oui, je pense que la vidéo est démarrée. Alors, la question est, disons, la question par laquelle je commence est celle-ci. Comment sortir de la peur et accepter la transformation de nos points de repère? Comment être apte à prendre part à la construction d'un monde défait? Comment se construire ou se reconstruire soi-même? On peut se demander, en effet, s'il y a quelque chose de nouveau si l'on compare la COVID-19 à d'autres pandémies. D'autres maladies contagieuses, on le sait, se répandent à grande échelle, par exemple en Afrique, Ebola, Sida, dengue, etc. Cependant, ces épidémies sont vécues différemment dans les régions du monde. Rappelons brièvement le contexte de la pandémie actuelle. Au début de l'année 2020, le Covid-19 semblait si loin. Il se passait quelque chose en Chine. On ne pouvait pas savoir ce qui se passait. Et quand on ne peut pas savoir ce qui se passe, on a le sentiment qu'il se passe quelque chose dans une région du monde et cela provoque la crainte de ce qui pourrait nous atteindre. Cette crainte, on a voulu la conjurer, du moins dans un premier temps. En effet, on a entendu dire, ça et là, c'est le virus chinois. Ici, je peux même ajouter qu'un président de la République qu'on connaît bien, le président sortant des États-Unis, qu'il a nommément désigné comme étant le virus chinois. N'empêche que ce virus inconnu et invisible par définition a fini par traverser toutes les frontières. Il a envahi donc notre monde. Et l'on continue de chercher les moyens de lutter contre un envahisseur infinitésimal qui prend le monde et l'ensemble des humains en otage. Les vaccins, qui font partie des moyens de lutte contre la pandémie, sont-ils rassurants? Ils font partie de la grande peur qui entoure la COVID-19. Il y a d'abord, il faut le dire, l'effet de surprise au moment de l'apparition de la maladie. Ensuite, la gestion plus ou moins incertaine de la pandémie. Puis, l'imaginaire qui se déploie autour du virus, dont l'aptitude à désorganiser notre monde provoque la peur qui se manifeste à plusieurs niveaux. Mais de quoi s'agit-il? Si la propagation du virus échappe à tout contrôle, la peur devient de plus en plus complexe au fur et à mesure de l'évolution de la pandémie. Mais la constatation des faits est une circonstance aggravante de la peur. Activité humaine réduite, aéroports déserts, avions à l'arrêt, frontières fermées et j'en passe. À l'intérieur des espaces d'habitation, les mouvements des corps sont drastiquement réduits. Si la vie est mouvement à tout point de vue, c'est-à-dire activité du corps humain, déplacement d'un lieu à l'autre, l'humain ne vit pas isolé. Lié qu'il est à la totalité du monde et relié à d'autres humains et d'autres vivants. Il prend donc le risque de construire des passages, des passerelles et des ponts, qui sont tous des activités que j'inclus dans la notion d'habiter, que je pense être donc en péril. Le virus de la COVID-19 se présente comme l'intrus qui tétanise et défait le monde construit au jour le jour. Pour comprendre de quoi cette peur si complexe est le nom, il faut prendre en compte les faits, les discours, les images diffusées à grande échelle, ce que j'appellerais le grand récit de la COVID du monde. Évidemment, je ne vais pas vous raconter ce récit, puisque je pense que tout le monde sait de quoi il s'agit. Mais je pense que ce récit commence par la perte de nos repères. Donc, le premier point sur lequel j'insiste, c'est ceci, être perdu dans un monde incertain. Nous vivons sans doute une situation inédite. S'il y a eu d'autres pandémies dans l'histoire de l'humanité, le monde n'était pas encore celui que nous connaissons aujourd'hui, avec ses moyens de communication, le niveau de développement des sciences, techniques et technologies, les progrès de la médecine, la présence des réseaux sociaux, et j'en passe. On se demande en effet que deviennent les humains qui subissent les effets de la crise qui se présente d'abord comme la rupture de la linéarité du temps vécu. Mais l'humain a de la mémoire. Il se rappelle qu'il y a eu hier, il ne sait plus de quoi aujourd'hui est fait et si demain verra le jour. C'est la notion donc de passage du temps qui est en cause, puisqu'elle n'est plus ce qu'elle était, tandis que nous avons l'impression que notre espace d'habitation se transforme. Or, pour habiter quelque part, l'humain a besoin de ses repères spatio-temporels, sans lesquels il se sent perdu dans un monde incertain qu'il ne reconnaît pas. L'insécurité, qui est donc, à mon avis, un autre nom de la peur, fait désormais partie de la vie. Or, nous avons peur de l'insécurité, peur d'avoir peur, de cette peur qui monte en spirale. En effet, la peur éprouvée qui nous empêche de dormir, le désespoir, les idées suicidaires, c'est de cela que je parle ici. D'où vient donc cette peur dont la figure est celle du cercle vicieux? Pour Descartes, si je dois citer un auteur, pour Descartes, par exemple, la peur, et on le sait, il parle aussi d'épouvante, les deux mots ont la même origine latine, c'est-à-dire le pavor, peur soudaine ou aussi l'effroi. La peur soudaine et violente est cette passion ou ce trouble de l'âme qui résulte de la surprise provoquée par l'événement qui survient. Donc, pour l'éviter, il s'agit de se préparer à tous les événements que l'on peut craindre. Ce qui surprend l'humain, c'est ce qu'il n'a pas su anticiper, ce à quoi il ne s'attendait pas. Mais on ne peut s'empêcher de penser au sage stoïcien. Celui-ci est constant et imperturbable, comme nous le dit par exemple Sénèque dans La constance du sage. Donc, ce sage n'est jamais surpris par ce qui lui arrive. Il sait qu'il peut être riche un jour et le lendemain tout perdre. Il sera toujours égal à lui-même. Il est donc sans crainte. Il ne craint rien, surtout pas la mort. Sa vraie patrie étant le monde, pas la société où il vit, à la merci du regard des autres. Mais on l'aura compris, au XXIe siècle, l'imprévisible fait partie de notre monde parce que la maladie et la mort en font partie. Aujourd'hui, vivre, c'est prendre des risques, c'est avoir le courage de résister, c'est-à-dire braver toutes sortes de menaces, et d'abord celles qui concernent notre santé. Mais faut-il prendre aussi le risque de perdre sa liberté? Le deuxième point de mon intervention, je l'ai intitulé « Politique et sentiment d'insécurité ». Si donc la peur naît du défaut d'anticipation et du manque de courage quand survient l'inattendu, la peur grandit. Les faits, mais aussi ce qui relève de l'imaginaire et les représentations qui entourent les faits sont la cause d'une peur diffuse, un mal-être qui envahit nos corps et nos esprits. C'est ce que j'appelle le sentiment d'insécurité. C'est justement à propos de la préservation de la santé que le sentiment d'insécurité s'accroît. Mais sait-on ce qu'est la santé? Parce que nous n'en savons rien. Les bruits du monde, les rumeurs, les discours et tout ce qu'on entend par exemple sur les réseaux sociaux, des discours divers et variés sur l'état de la pandémie et la gestion de la maladie par les politiques accroissent ce sentiment de mal-être. En effet, l'État veut jouer son propre rôle de protection des citoyens. Mais on constate que le scientifique ou l'expert en matière de santé physique ou psychique devient le conseiller du politique. Ici, on pourrait citer le politique de Platon, dans lequel Platon a imaginé que le philosophe pouvait être l'allié le plus sûr du gouvernant. Mais cette alliance ici et maintenant, c'est l'alliance entre la gestion des affaires publiques et politiques du soin qui peut aggraver toutes les peurs latentes. L'alliance qu'on peut nommer, sans risque de se tromper, biopolitique, est diversement acceptée selon les pays, les cultures et les croyances. La perte de confiance se joue ici, entre le politique et les citoyens, dont il veut gérer la santé. Mais ne pas croire en la parole du politique peut avoir l'illusion de préserver sa santé individuelle. Ici, on pourrait comparer les pays et montrer que ce ne sont pas les humains de tous les pays qui ont peur de perdre leur place dans leur monde, peur de mourir parce qu'il n'y a plus d'activité, plus de mouvement, plus de déplacement. Dans certains pays, en effet, on réagit autrement, parfois dans la bonne humeur. On fait de la pédagogie, on essaie de dédramatiser la situation. Je cite ici, par exemple, le cas du président de Madagascar qui a trouvé un remède, une potion à partir de la plante Artemisia. On essaie de conjurer la peur par la création artistique, par exemple par la musique, par la peinture ou par la création de mots. Je sais que dans beaucoup de pays africains, il y a une coiffure qu'on appelle aujourd'hui coiffure Corona. On essaie donc de prendre soin de ce qui reste quand survient une pandémie. Faire face au changement pour habiter le monde, c'est mon dernier point. La pandémie du Covid-19 nous donne donc des leçons de vie. Nous ne sommes pas égaux face à la pandémie, c'est le moins qu'on puisse dire. Parce que nous n'avons pas le choix. Nous devons faire face à la nouvelle configuration du monde dans laquelle les anciennes inégalités perdurent, plus menaçantes que le virus lui-même. Il y a des pays que l'on entend ou voit peu sur l'échiquier du monde. Pourtant, ils se battent. Pourtant, les humains, habitués à toutes sortes de catastrophes, ont appris à gérer leur être ensemble autrement. Ils ont sans doute d'autres idées de la gestion du soin. Ils font encore confiance à ce que leur offre la nature, même si on se demande pour combien de temps. Mais qui sommes-nous? Nous apprenons en situation que le corps humain est périssable et non pas mortel. C'est Heidegger nous disait en effet qu'il y a une différence entre une chose évidemment et le corps humain, dans la mesure où c'est la chose qui est périssable et donc le corps humain qui est mortel. Or, notre monde est saturé d'images et de mots qui racontent à quel point le corps humain, fragile, diminué, par exemple en cas de coma artificiel, et augmenté par la même occasion, parce qu'on montre les corps entubés. Donc, le corps est cette chose devenue une masse informe que l'on peut déposer n'importe où, quand il cesse de respirer. On l'enterre dans la quasi-clandestinité. Mais nous savons que le corps, même quand il ressemble donc à cette masse informe, il continue de penser. Il a encore un esprit. Mais on voit bien que le corps perd sa dignité de corps humain. Et l'humain qui regarde ces images se rappelle que son propre visage a perdu sa dignité de visage, ce par quoi il est reconnaissable parmi d'autres humains, tout aussi singuliers que lui. Mais le visage camouflé en situation d'urgence sanitaire et la peur de la contamination qui sature nos lieux de vie indiquent ce qui est en jeu, la préservation du lien de l'humain à l'humain, qui passe par la collaboration, la coopération, la solidarité entre humains et non-humains, entre riches et pauvres, inclus et exclus. Ces concepts qu'il faut penser à nouveau frais pour avoir le courage de faire face au changement, manière de prévoir ce qui pourrait arriver à l'humain et défaire le monde, manière de construire un monde plus juste et solidaire. Il s'agit donc d'inventer des repères communs pour être aptes à vivre ensemble. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Tanella, for that.
Okay.
I would like to remind those who are participating with us that you are free to ask questions that I will be happy to read to our speakers. But to get us started, you make a point about how human beings need references in time and space in order to navigate. And that's been one of the things that, at least for myself, I found so difficult because we're mostly at home, our time and our space all sort of blends into one another. So I was curious if you had any suggestions on to how we could find those reference in time and space.
Comment retrouver nos propres repères? Et je crois qu'il faut d'abord trouver les moyens de faire face à la peur. Parce qu'en fait, ce qui fait que nous perdons nos repères, c'est le fait d'imaginer, le fait d'avoir le sentiment que tout est perdu, que nous sommes enfermés, que nous avons par exemple perdu notre liberté. Et peut-être que je n'ai pas insisté là-dessus. Il me semble qu'il faut beaucoup de courage. Et je sais que le courage, ce n'est pas d'abord l'héroïsme, c'est-à-dire l'exploit qu'on va accomplir en un temps précis et après c'est fini. Il me semble que le courage a besoin justement de temps. C'est ça aussi le paradoxe, c'est-à-dire pour retrouver nos propres repères, c'est comme si nous devions nous recentrer sur nous-mêmes d'abord, ne pas avoir peur de nous-mêmes pour mieux regarder ce qui se passe autour de nous. C'est ce que je peux dire. Et c'est à ce moment-là que nous pouvons retrouver nos propres repères. Mais seulement, je suis en train de me poser la question de savoir si ces repères retrouvés seront les mêmes que ceux que nous avions avant la pandémie. C'est ça. Mais le problème, c'est que je crois qu'il faut accepter les nouveaux repères que nous construisons parce que nous avons eu le courage de faire face au changement. Donc, voilà ce que je peux dire.
Thank you for that. I am going to read some of the questions that are coming in. So we have a question from Amaury Montadon, and they ask how to explain this uncertain confusion in a world where information reigns and goes faster and faster, where we only move back to the inevitable by trying to anticipate as much all possible disasters. You're muted. Tanella, we can't hear you. Your microphone is muted.
Yes, I see. Yes, yes. It's okay now? Oui, oui. Est-ce que ça va là?
Oui, nous vous entendons.
Oui,
can,
bon,
yes.
ce que je voulais dire, je crois que je n'ai pas tout à fait compris la question qui m'a été posée tout à l'heure. Est-ce qu'on peut répéter rapidement cette question?
Yes. So the question was how to deal with the nature of fear when so much of the information that we're getting comes and goes so quickly. And it seems that the nature of what we're dealing with is constantly in flux.
Ah oui, oui, c'est vrai que nous sommes à l'heure de la, comment dire, de la vitesse de tout ce qui se passe sur les réseaux sociaux notamment, et il n'y a pas que les réseaux sociaux, hein, il y a tout ce que j'appelle d'ailleurs les bruits du monde, hein, ça vient de partout. Il y a les nouvelles les plus alarmistes, il y a toutes ces vidéos qui circulent, etc. Mais encore une fois, moi, je pense qu'il faut peut-être se dire que nous avons encore une raison. Oui, il faut revenir à soi, parce qu'on ne peut pas faire face si on ne sait pas de quoi il s'agit. Il me semble que soi-même, même si on pense qu'on est déjà par terre, qu'on n'est peut-être rien, qu'on est complètement, dans mon texte, j'ai parlé de tétaniser. Parce que c'est vrai, être tétanisé, c'est être immobile, être incapable de faire quoi que ce soit. Mais il me semble que c'est à ce moment-là qu'on est capable de faire un sursaut, c'est-à-dire se relever. Je suis peut-être de ceux qui croient en l'idée de résilience. Je me dis que peut-être plus on est, je ne sais pas, au fond de quelque chose, plus justement on est capable de faire le sursaut et d'abord sur soi-même afin de pouvoir faire face. Parce qu'on ne peut pas faire face comme ça si on ne compte pas sur ses propres ressources. Et on les trouve où? Je serais tenté de dire, vous savez, en France aujourd'hui, il y a ce débat sur pourquoi les librairies sont fermées, etc. Est-ce que le livre, c'est un bien essentiel? Je suis vraiment de ceux qui pensent que le livre, c'est vraiment plus qu'important. Il y a des pays aussi où il n'y a pas de livre, mais il y a des paroles, je dirais, de paix, des paroles apaisantes, des paroles qu'on raconte, c'est-à-dire d'autres types de récits qui nous aident à construire le monde, qui nous aident donc à nous relever et à regarder et à faire face à ce qui nous arrive à nous et ce qui arrive au monde.
Thank you. I want to be mindful of the time. We've got about 5 more minutes, so I think we have at least time for one more question. And this one is from an anonymous participant, but they ask something more practical. They ask if you could elaborate on ways that fear can be mitigated in African countries. Is the notion of fear linked to our cultural contexts?
Il me semble qu'on a peur différemment, et c'est peut-être selon les pays, et dans les pays aussi, bon, c'est vrai, c'est Aristote qui disait qu'il faut prendre les choses en plusieurs sens, c'est-à-dire en tout, il faut le prendre en plusieurs sens. Et donc, pour moi, c'est vrai, il y a peur et peur, selon qu'on est même une femme ou un homme, selon qu'on est un jeune ou une personne âgée, et ainsi de suite. Donc, c'est vrai, selon nos connaissances, nos savoirs, nos cultures, nos croyances, la peur, elle peut se décrire de telle ou telle manière. Ce que nous appelons donc peur n'est pas, je veux dire par là qu'il n'y a pas une seule essence de la peur, si je puis m'exprimer ainsi. Cela dépend de nos propres ressources culturelles, religieuses, et je dirais bien plus. Cela dépend aussi de notre propre environnement, je dirais de la société, de la communauté, de la famille. Mais j'ajoute un autre mot qui, selon moi, en tout cas, essaie de résumer ce que je pense depuis quelque temps. Cela dépend de la manière dont nous habitons. Habiter, c'est-à-dire prendre possession de tout ce qu'il y a autour de nous et être capable de faire face à tous les dangers. Essayer de relever les défis avec ce que nous sommes, avec ce que nous pensons, et essayer de voir où nous pouvons aller avec cela. Et essayer de voir comment, justement, nous pouvons dialoguer avec celles et ceux qui ne nous connaissent pas. Donc, c'est pour dire simplement qu'il n'y a pas une seule et même peur. Il y a différents types de peur, il y a différents niveaux de peur, et aussi cela dépend de ce que nous sommes et comment nous avons appris. Il y a toujours dans mon idée, il y a toujours l'idée de l'apprentissage, de l'éducation, parce que j'estime que rien ne se fait pas en un seul jour. Et comme vous le savez, Aristote le disait bien, une hirondelle ne fait pas le printemps. On a besoin vraiment de temps, et surtout au moment où le temps nous manque. Parce que nous savons que par temps de pandémie, ce qui nous manque le plus, c'est le temps.
Thank you so much for that, Tanella. I really appreciate your time this morning and for your remarks. You've given us a lot to think about. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Luc Foisneau. Luc Foisneau is a French philosopher. He is a specialist in modern and contemporary political thought. He is the research director at CNRS. He is a member of the Raymond Aron Center for Sociological and Political Studies and teaches at the School of Higher Studies in Social Sciences. He devoted his doctoral thesis to a little studied aspect of the theory of power according to Hobbes, his conception of omnipotence, stressing both the importance of the notion of the absolute power of God in a philosopher considered to be an atheist, and the link between this notion and the main concepts of the moral and political philosophy of the author of the Leviathan. In 2001, for the publication resulting from his thesis, he received the grand prize from the Association of Professors and Lecturers of Sciences in Paris. He is today one of the recognized scholars of Hobbes' work, which he has translated into French and has commented on. Luc, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Jamie. As a matter of fact, in Paris, it's the afternoon, so we're not on the same continent, but it's good. Thank you for your presentation, and also I wanted to. Je voulais plutôt commencer, puisque vous parliez anglais, j'avais envie de vous répondre en anglais, mais je voulais commencer par remercier l'UNESCO pour cette invitation, et je me réjouis d'avoir pu écouter la professeure Boni au début de cette table ronde. Et je voudrais maintenant vous présenter quelques considérations autour effectivement d'un auteur du XVIIe siècle, mais dont l'actualité est très grande pour nous aujourd'hui. Et j'essaierai donc de vous montrer en quoi cet auteur est susceptible de nous aider à penser les relations entre la crainte, la confiance et le risque. Et je voudrais également ajouter une autre thèse. Donc, quand on traverse une période d'épidémie comme celle que nous traversons depuis quelques mois, on est effectivement très fort dans des conditions entièrement nouvelles. Ce qui allait de soi avant le confinement, sortir de son domicile librement, perdre son évidence. Et aussi des pratiques de sociabilité auxquelles on n'avait jamais prêté attention auparavant si l'on n'est pas ethnologue, comme de serrer la main pour se saluer, deviennent ces pratiques d'agression majeures. On pourrait multiplier les exemples qui montrent que quand l'épidémie est là, on ne vit plus dans des conditions normales. La question que je voudrais poser, c'est est-ce que cette impression de transformation et de changement radical correspond véritablement à la réalité? Notre première impression, de fait, la plus forte et souvent la seule, est ainsi que l'épidémie nous ferait entrer dans un nouveau régime anthropologique et politique. L'épidémie transformerait nos relations à autrui, elle modifierait en profondeur les conditions de notre vie politique. Dans ce bref exposé, je voudrais soutenir l'idée selon laquelle notre régime épidémique actuel est certes très dommageable pour notre vie, la qualité de nos relations humaines et notre économie, mais qui ne constitue pas un régime d'exception au sens où nos relations à autrui, que ce soit au niveau personnel ou au niveau politique, en seraient transformées du tout au tout. Pour enfoncer le clou, je soutiendrai que la situation épidémique constitue un moment de vérité qui fait apparaître au contraire au grand jour un certain aspect assez désagréable, il faut bien le dire, de nos relations humaines. Et pour éviter de passer pour un provocateur, j'appuierai mon propos sur un auteur classique du XVIIe auquel j'ai consacré beaucoup de ma recherche, et en particulier mon dernier livre intitulé « Hobbes, la vie inquiète ». Cet auteur, c'est Thomas Hobbes, un auteur qui a vécu à la fin, qui est né à la fin du règne d'Élisabeth Ier et qui est mort en 1679. Donc, il a traversé tout son siècle et il a connu beaucoup, effectivement, de calamités et a connu également la grande peste de Londres en 1655. Je peux formuler ma proposition de discussion de la manière suivante. Les conditions dans lesquelles l'épidémie actuelle nous fait vivre ne sont pas fondamentalement différentes des conditions dans lesquelles nous vivons en temps ordinaire. Je sais que c'est un petit peu provocateur, mais je voudrais essayer de me défendre parce qu'effectivement, la thèse peut paraître très étrange. Comment il dit les conditions ne sont pas différentes des conditions actuelles alors que tout a changé. Donc, permettez-moi d'essayer d'expliquer ce point et d'essayer de le faire à l'aide de Thomas Hobbes. Donc, pour ne pas perdre notre problème de vue, je rappelle la question qui nous occupe. L'épidémie modifie-t-elle la nature de nos interactions sociales et politiques? Alors, pour répondre à cette question, je vais vous proposer deux séries de remarques. La première, d'abord une première série de remarques pour essayer de vous persuader que Hobbes est le bon auteur pour comprendre le lien qui existe entre la crainte, la confiance et le risque, et puis ensuite une deuxième série de remarques pour défendre l'idée que les idées de Hobbes sur la peur et la conscience trouvent une confirmation dans les conditions de crise épidémique. Alors, premier moment, ce serait une présentation ultra courte, je vais appeler ça Hobbes en 3 temps, la crainte, la confiance, le risque. Quand on ne sait rien de Hobbes, et c'est peut-être le cas de certains et certaines d'entre vous, on sait au moins qu'il a défendu une thèse. Quelle est cette thèse scandaleuse selon laquelle nous ne serions pas poussés les uns vers les autres par un goût des relations sociales, par l'amour d'autrui, mais au contraire par la crainte d'autrui. C'est-à-dire, sa thèse fondamentalement, c'est que nous autres êtres humains sommes des animaux craintifs. Alors, comment, me direz-vous, peut-on dire une chose aussi absurde? Si je crains autrui, ça serait, je poursuis votre objection, je ne cherche pas à m'associer à lui, mais à le fuir. Si la thèse de Hobbes était vraie, que nous sommes des êtres craintifs et non pas sociaux, nous vivrions tous dans les bois et nous éviterions nos voisins dès que nous le pourrions. Et pourtant, c'est la thèse que je voudrais défendre, c'est Hobbes qui a raison en soulignant le fait qu'un certain nombre de nos interactions sociales sont le produit non pas de l'amour d'autrui, mais de la crainte. Quand nous le réfutons en disant que ces propos sont absurdes, c'est souvent que nous confondons deux sentiments, deux variantes, si vous voulez, de la crainte. D'une part, la peur qui nous pousse à la prudence et la crainte qui est une crainte panique. Il est évident que la panique ne nous incite pas à créer des associations puisqu'elle nous pousse à fuir. Mais si vous y réfléchissez un petit peu plus profondément, la crainte prudente vous inciterait plutôt à entretenir de bonnes relations avec vos semblables. Donc le texte le plus célèbre de Hobbes, qui se trouve dans le premier chapitre de son ouvrage publié en 1642 et puis en 1647 qui s'intitule Du citoyen, il dit cela, donc Hobbes nous dit cela de manière très imagée. Voilà l'image dans les trois types d'associations que nous formons avec autrui, quand nous faisons de la politique, quand nous faisons des affaires ou que nous cherchons à, disons, nous divertir, ce qui nous pousse, nous dit-il, ce n'est pas l'amour des autres, mais deux considérations qui relèvent de notre rapport à nous-mêmes, la recherche d'une part de notre intérêt et d'autre part la recherche de la réputation. Sur ce dernier point, toute personne ayant une pratique même limitée des réseaux sociaux, et je suis sûr que vous êtes nombreux à avoir une telle pratique, comprend ce que Hobbes veut dire. Et sur le premier point, la question de l'intérêt, il suffit d'avoir été engagé dans une entreprise à but plus ou moins lucratif pour comprendre qu'il a raison. On peut ajouter que la crainte, dont parle Hobbes comme d'une passion paradoxale de l'association, n'a rien à voir avec une angoisse existentielle. Je voyais tout à l'heure une question adressée à Madame Boni sur ce point. Ça n'a rien à voir avec une angoisse existentielle. L'angoisse existentielle véritable humaine, la passion de la crainte dont parle Hobbes est une passion qui, au contraire, nous conduit d'un point de vue à nous assembler quand les conditions de la confiance sont réunies. Donc, ce que je veux dire, c'est que dans un cas peur existentielle, on essaie de comprendre la nature de notre condition humaine, etc. Dans le cadre de la crainte prudentielle chez Hobbes, cette passion, elle nous conduit à nous assembler, mais à condition que ces conditions, disons, politiques soient réunies. Ce qu'il nous faut comprendre maintenant, c'est donc, deuxième point, le rapport entre la crainte et la confiance. Si la crainte est un sentiment naturel chez les êtres humains, donc ça c'est la thèse de Hobbes, vous n'êtes pas d'accord avec ça, on pourrait dire d'un certain point de vue que pour Hobbes, les êtres humains sont naturellement phobiques, eh bien la confiance à l'inverse est un sentiment qui suppose des conditions artificielles. Donc la crainte selon Hobbes serait naturelle, la confiance artificielle. Et pour le dire de manière rapide, la confiance est quelque chose qui se construit. Alors, on le dit, des relations personnelles, mais c'est encore plus vrai des relations entre un grand nombre de personnes, ce qu'on appelle la politique. Et c'est bien ce problème de la construction de la confiance que Hobbes met au premier plan de sa théorie politique. Avant d'être une structure administrative, l'État est pour Hobbes le nom de la condition qui nous permet d'établir des relations humaines fondées sur la confiance. Il se trouve en effet qu'il considère, et on peut ne pas être encore une fois d'accord avec lui, que les conditions de la confiance sont fournies par l'existence d'une puissance chargée d'assurer la paix à l'aide de lois, ce que l'on appelle un État souverain. Mais je voudrais attirer votre attention sur le fait que le problème qui nous occupe est plus général que le problème de l'État, c'est celui du rapport entre la crainte et la confiance, et que bien évidemment, il y a d'autres solutions pour résoudre ce problème que la solution de Hobbes. Donc, avançons encore un peu. On a vu le rapport, ce qu'était la crainte pour Hobbes, le rapport entre la crainte et la confiance. Maintenant, quel est le rapport entre la confiance et le risque? Si nos relations à autrui sont fondées sur la crainte, vous me direz qu'il sera difficile d'une association quelle qu'elle soit. Fondée sur la crainte, Et je le précise, cette crainte que la confiance que nous nous plaçons ou que nous accordons les uns aux autres ne soit pas réciproque. En fait, cette crainte chez Hobbes, c'est une crainte d'être déçu par autrui. Et sa thèse politique et morale est que nous avons besoin d'une structure forte, pour lui c'est l'État, pour mettre de la confiance ou introduire de la confiance. Autrement dit, la crainte humaines sont la plupart du temps des liens faibles. Précis point, parce que je pense que beaucoup d'entre vous seront ces propos, je voudrais préciser ce que Hobbes entend ici, faire un jugement sur la qualité de nos sentiments autres, sur le fait que, dans certains cas, extrêmement forts pour lesquels nous sommes à risquer nos vies. Il dit nous ne pouvons pas faire reposer la confiance nécessaire à nos associations ordinaires, que ce soit professionnelles, familiales ou amicales, sur la seule force des sentiments. Autrement dit, ici, si vous voulez, la thèse de Hobbes est une thèse anti-romantique ou plutôt une thèse hostile au romantisme en politique. Et c'est d'ailleurs pour ça aussi, je voulais le dire avant de passer à la thèse que je voudrais soutenir à partir de lui, que c'est un auteur qui n'a pas été considéré comme un auteur aimable. Donc venons-en maintenant au rapport entre cette liaison ou pensée de Hobbes entre confiance, entre la crainte, la confiance et le risque, et nos questions d'épidémie. Ce que j'essaie de dire de manière simple, pour le dire de manière simple, c'est que Hobbes nous aide à penser des choses, la situation épidémique nous aide à penser des choses que Hobbes a tenté de nous faire comprendre dans son anthropologie et dans sa politique. Donc, quelle est cette idée que je voudrais essayer de proposer à la discussion? Que entre crainte, confiance et risque se trouve confirmée plutôt que contredit par les conditions de la crise épidémique actuelle. On trouve un premier argument en faveur de cette confirmation dans le fait que les maladies contagieuses, étant des maladies que l'on contracte par l'intermédiaire d'autrui, elles font de celui-ci une source raisonnable de crainte. Si l'on serre la main ou si l'on s'adresse la parole sans masque à moins d'1 mètre, nous risquons de nous transmettre le virus, à supposer que nous en soyons porteurs, ce que l'on ne sait pas toujours. La transmission d'un virus par contagion transforme ainsi nos relations à autrui dans un sens phobique. Le SARS-CoV-2 produit cet effet de crainte beaucoup extrême. Ça, c'est le premier point. Et on a une thèse de Hobbes est adaptée au temps épidémique dans le fait que nous sommes égaux, non pas face à la maladie, ce qui est faux, mais en tant qu'agent potentiellement propagateur du virus, du SARS, développer de maladie, être un porteur asymptomatique, un risque à autrui. Nous sommes donc obligés de nous comporter les uns à l'égard des autres comme si nous étions tous porteurs du virus. Des égaux, comme dit la théorie morale de notre côté en tant qu'êtres moraux, simplement en tant que n'importe qui respire, de contaminer n'importe qui. Et c'est dans la capacité à mourir autrui, de manière involontaire certes, mais tout de même, justification choquante que Hobbes nous donne, puisque Hobbes nous dit que dans l'état de nature, on peut se causer mutuellement des choses égales, notre égalité est prouvée par notre capacité homicide. En période d'épidémie, donc, nous sommes égaux en tant qu'agents contaminateurs, également susceptibles de contaminer autrui. Il existe une troisième humaine en temps d'épidémie, et elle tient à la réponse qu'il nous propose pour sortir de cette situation intenable. Il nous dit que pour sortir de cette situation intenable, eh bien, nous avons besoin d'une structure qui s'appelle l'État. C'est la raison pour laquelle son ouvrage principal s'appelle le Léviathan. Il lui faut une structure qui nous fasse peur, comme le monstre biblique Léviathan faisait peur dans l'Antiquité. Donc ici, nous avons besoin de cet État pour coordonner notre action, et on voit bien effectivement que c'est le cas dans une période épidémique. Alors, on pourrait ajouter, si nous en avions le temps, mais je n'en ai pas le temps, que l'État, pour remplir ses fonctions, doit nous inspirer une peur spécifique, une peur politique que Hobbes appelle, il est le premier à le faire. Si vous voulez, je voudrais en venir maintenant à ma conclusion, puisque effectivement le temps passe. Nous avons donc vu que effectivement de ce lien entre la crainte et la confiance trouve effectivement dans la situation épidémique actuelle plutôt une confirmation qu'une infirmation. Nous sommes des êtres craintifs. L'apparition du virus ne nous rend pas craintifs. L'apparition du virus révèle certains traits de notre nature humaine. Le fait que nous ayons besoin d'une structure pour coordonner elle est déjà présente dans une période normale, c'est ce que Hobbes voulait nous faire dire. Alors pour conclure ce rapprochement entre la logique sanitaire et la logique politique en régime de souveraineté, on peut résumer les arguments que j'ai avancés de la manière suivante. Alors, bon, non, je vais pas résumer, enfin, notre égalité en tant que porteur éventuel du virus suscite une crainte rationnelle et cette crainte suscite à son tour la volonté parfaitement raisonnable de sortir d'un état contraire à la confiance dont nous avons besoin pour entretenir des relations sociales. Or, pour réunir les conditions de la confiance, nous devons disposer d'un dispositif susceptible de nous inspirer à tous une peur égale. La crainte que nous inspire le virus ne serait pas capable de nous faire respecter à elle seule des règles sanitaires si elle ne reposait pas aussi sur une certaine crainte de l'État. Alors, maintenant, j'aurais voulu terminer cette présentation par un argument visuel. J'espère que vous arriverez à voir cet argument visuel sur vos écrans. Je voudrais confirmer ce que je viens de dire en essayant de regarder effectivement la page qui était sur l'édition de 1651 du Léviathan, c'est ce qu'on appelle le Léviathan. Donc vous y voyez un grand bonhomme avec à l'intérieur de lui un ensemble de petits personnages et c'est une page de titre avec le titre, etc. Ce personnage a beaucoup de caractéristiques que je n'ai pas le temps de, disons, d'analyser, mais je voudrais, pour confirmer ma thèse, peut-être un penseur pour comprendre non seulement une période, nos vies en temps d'épidémie, mais que lui-même a pu penser les conditions normales de la politique par rapport à l'épidémie, je voudrais attirer votre attention sur un détail insignifiant de ce frontispice que j'ai entouré effectivement d'un trait jaune. Et si Tara veut bien faire apparaître la deuxième image, vous allez vous rendre compte que sur le frontispice, ces deux petits personnages portent un manteau noir et un masque sur le visage en forme de gros nez. Vous les voyez maintenant, hein, donc ces deux petits personnages avec un masque et un manteau. Ces deux petits personnages sont des docteurs de la peste tels qu'ils ont pu circuler à Londres en 1665 lors de la grande peste de Londres qui a fait 75 000 morts. Donc la dernière image que je voudrais vous montrer, cette dernière image, je l'ai tirée d'un article de ma collègue Francesca Falk. C'est un personnage, ces personnages habillés tels qu'ils étaient, vous le voyez avec un grand manteau et un masque en forme de bec d'oiseau. Eh bien, ce personnage, c'est le personnage qui allait s'occuper effectivement des malades pendant la peste. Donc, si Hobbes n'a pas réalisé lui-même ce frontispice, la présence de ces docteurs de la peste nous rappelle subtilement que l'anthropologie et la politique de Hobbes sont aussi nées d'une réflexion sur les transformations que les épidémies induisent dans le comportement des habitants des villes. Cette image, on pourrait se demander si Hobbes ne dit pas tout ce qu'il dit de la politique aussi parce qu'il aurait réfléchi à ce que les épidémies font à nos relations humaines. Voilà la thèse que je voulais proposer à la discussion et je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you so much, Luke. I'm just navigating the technology here. Give me a second. Okay. So thank you so much for that. I do have a question that I would like to ask you, but I want to make sure that we get time for some other questions first. In fact, one of our participants, Julian, asked that you say that the pandemics makes us fear others. It also emphasizes our dependence on others. Don't we have as much reason to reply with hope than with fear?
Merci beaucoup pour cette question. Merci à Julian. Effectivement, la question qu'on pourrait se poser, c'est est-ce que la situation d'épidémie ne pourrait pas plutôt nous faire réagir par l'espoir que la crainte? Bon, ma réponse, elle est purement factuelle. Réfléchissons à la première réaction qui est la nôtre lorsqu'on apprend que, comme Camus dans La Peste, par exemple, et je sais que Jamie est une grande lectrice de Camus, c'est bien la peur. Alors, la question, pour répondre à Julian de manière plus développée, la première réaction est la crainte, mais la deuxième réaction est de se dire comment allons-nous recréer les conditions de la confiance avec les gens qui nous entourent. Donc, et cette réaction en deux temps, c'est véritablement la réaction hobbesienne. D'abord, nous avons une crainte, mais comme la crainte pour Hobbes est une réaction, est une passion en quelque sorte qui va de pair avec l'exercice de la raison, nous allons réfléchir aux manières de modifier, de recréer les conditions de la confiance en période épidémique. Et par exemple, là où j'habite, si vous voulez, lors du premier confinement, il y avait des étudiants qui n'avaient rien à manger, etc., ou qui étaient dans une situation difficile dans les universités, ceux qui n'avaient pas pu rejoindre leur famille. Bien évidemment, on n'a pas attendu l'État, les gens se sont organisés pour réunir des vivres et faire en sorte que ces vivres soient acheminés. Dans les grandes périodes, effectivement, de catastrophes nationales, etc., les gens ont d'abord peur et ensuite recréent les conditions de la confiance. Donc, si ce que Julian veut dire par espoir, c'est recréer les conditions de la confiance, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec cette idée-là.
Thank you. So someone else had asked, do these links to Hobbes' thought, do you think they vary according to the nature of the political regime in which these responses to the epidemic are taking place? Does it make a difference if the sovereign that needs to be appealed to is a democracy, for example, or a dictatorship?
Merci. Et bon, ça, c'est une très bonne question, effectivement, parce que Hobbes, c'est l'État. Évidemment, pour lui, il peut y avoir des régimes extrêmement différents. Et je pense que la politique qui consacrent toute leur énergie à créer les conditions de la confiance entre leurs citoyens, à faire en sorte, par des mesures, par exemple, de protection, d'éducation, les gens puissent, disons, porter les citoyens sur le mode de la confiance. Et il y a d'autres régimes, les tyrannies, qui développent au contraire chez leurs citoyens le sentiment et de la crainte. Pourquoi? Une tyrannie au pouvoir, les habitants de la tyrannie du pays en qui ont moins de confiance les uns dans les autres. C'est Montesquieu, dans l'esprit des lois, bien évidemment, qui a insisté sur ce point. Mais donc, cette question qui a été posée me paraît tout à fait essentielle. La structure, le fait qu'il y ait un État est essentiel pour Hobbes. Et il est conscient également de l'importance des politiques publiques qui sont bien évidemment extrêmement différentes selon la nature des régimes.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Sebastian Munier, and this is for you and also Tanella Boni. And he asks, does Hobbesian politics resemble what Achille Mbembe calls the apolitics of the initiate?
Est-ce que word, because my connection is not so good. Just I understand the use the author.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. I can send you the.
Okay, do you hear better now? Do you hear me better? No, yeah, okay. But I mean, I don't know the author. Achille Mbembe, I don't know him very well, so I can't answer that question properly.
Okay, that's a fair response. And then I
Okay.
guess lastly, we've got about 5 more minutes before we need to move on.
Yeah.
And so I was curious, you had said to me in private conversation that in thinking about this presentation, you had gone back to Camus' La Peste, and it had helped you sort of think about this. So I was curious what stood out to you. My read of Camus is that he comes away with a very different sense of human nature and what's possible than Hobbes seems to suggest. And so how did your read of La Peste inform your thinking about this? And I guess most specifically, where do you think he goes wrong?
Je ne sais pas. Merci beaucoup, Jamie, pour cette question. Je suis pas sûr, etc. La Peste, là, j'ai relu, c'est vraiment un roman magnifique, mais je crois que Camus dans La Peste est particulièrement, ses jugements sont particulièrement intéressants dans la manière dont il analyse la transformation des relations entre les personnes, entre le moment où les gens pensent être dans un état de confiance, dans la ville d'Oran, tout va bien, on va se promener, etc. Et il décrit très bien progressivement la transformation de l'état d'esprit des gens et la transformation de, disons, leurs relations les uns avec les autres. Et puis aussi, j'ai beaucoup aimé la manière dont Camus nous décrit le passage, disons, de la manière dont les gens ne veulent pas croire qu'ils sont arrivés, qu'ils sont maintenant dans un état extrêmement dangereux. Au tout début, les gens se disent « Ah mais non, c'est pas si grave que ça ». Bon, je veux dire, ça va passer vite. Et nous réfléchissons exactement de la même manière que les habitants d'Oran dans La Peste de... On essaie sans cesse de se raconter des histoires et se dire « Ah mais oui, le confinement va bientôt se terminer, on va revenir au même ». Et ça, Camus, l'objet de pas les mêmes. En fait, l'objet de Camus, c'est d'un certain point de vue une critique des illusions humanistes qui peuvent être les nôtres. L'objet de Camus, c'est d'essayer de comprendre effectivement en quoi l'idée selon laquelle finalement nous serions des êtres civilisés, capables d'avoir confiance les uns dans les autres, serait quelque chose allant de soi, alors que le problème de Hobbes, c'est d'essayer de nous montrer que la ville, que ce soit sous une forme ou sous une autre, pas nécessairement sanitaire, à cette peste avec la même nôtre lorsque ce n'est pas là. Donc, il essaie de nous... Et d'un certain point de vue, ce qui nous incite à penser, c'est comment peut-on faire pour que les conditions politiques en période de peste, disons, se transforment, non pas, mais se transforment pour nous permettre de maintenir les conditions de la confiance, alors même que la peste est dans la ville. L'idée de Hobbes, c'est ça, et c'est pas l'idée de Camus n'est pas une idée politique en ce sens-là. L'idée de Hobbes, c'est comment faire quand la peste est dans la ville, quand le Covid est dans la ville, pour que nous puissions collectivement, par l'intermédiaire de nos régimes politiques, maintenir ce qui rend possible notre coopération les uns avec les autres. Hein, donc, je ne sais pas, Jamie, si vous allez être d'accord avec cette idée-là, mais c'est vrai que je pense que l'objet n'est pas exactement le même.
Okay. I would love to
La
discuss that
traduction, ça complète.
in more
Voilà.
detail with you, but unfortunately, given the time constraints, we have to move on. But yes, thank you. So our next speaker
Merci.
is Hartmut Rosa. He is a German sociologist and philosopher and teaches at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. He is part of a new generation of thinkers working in the wake of critical theory, or the Frankfurt School. In 2010, Hartmut Rosa published Alienation and Acceleration, a synthesis of his reflection on social acceleration that he links to the Marxist idea of alienation. He is one of the 35 thinkers who influenced the world, chosen by the New Literary Magazine in December 2018. He is also the sponsor of the UNESCO Chair in Philosophy with Children at the University of Nantes. Welcome, Hartmut. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for this kind introduction. I hope you can hear me. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And thanks for the invitation to this interesting conference. I think it's really important to have something like a World Philosophy Day, because I think it thinks about the connection between philosophy and the world. And I take philosophy really to be the mode in which we reflect on our relationship with the world, right? With the world we're living in and with the world we're living to, so to speak. The great French philosopher and phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he says that we live être au monde. We being in the world means being to the world and from the world and within the world, so to speak. And that's what I want to do. Really, I'm trying to develop a philosophy of our relationship to the world, so to speak, a self-world relationship. It doesn't start from the idea that there is a subject and the subject experiences a world, but who the subject is, how we form ourselves, how we experience ourselves, and who we are actually always depends on the relationship towards what we perceive to be around us and face to face with us, right? So the relationship towards the world is primary. And COVID, of course, this crisis, the virus, makes us rethink and actually re-experience it, right? What does it mean to be in the world today, to live in this world, to be to the world? And basically, I think fear is always a basic element of being in the world and to the world, right? Because I mean, I think there are kind of two impulses of movement. One is desire. Some things out there seem to be attractive, right? So on the one hand, we are lured into the world, right? Things are attractive. On the other hand, they are the opposite of attractive. They are repulsive, so to speak. And that's when fear comes in. Something is dangerous or not good for us also. So I think it's the dialectics between desiring things out there and shying away from them for varying reasons. Fear is maybe too blanket a term, but it's quite useful to start by thinking through it. And now the interesting thing is, how is this relationship changed due to the virus, the COVID SARS-CoV-2 virus? And my claim here is actually that it's a very interesting thing what's happening, because the basic modern mode, it's become kind of the global mode, right, of being in the world and being to the world, is the attempt to make it controllable, disponible, so to speak, in French, right? Because that's the title of the book, is of the small book I've just written, is Rendre le monde indisponible in French, but uncontrollability in English. And what I have in mind there, it really fits very, very neatly with what COVID does to us, or what we do to COVID. Because I think the main stance of modernity towards the world, modernity as a social formation, which has now kind of become it's influencing our way of living and being in and to the world on a global level. And the main stance is trying to achieve control, making the world available, attainable, and accessible, increasing the horizon of what we can control, what we can command, but also what we can attain and access and make available, right? And the interesting thing is that now, and of course we've done this through science, we want to know how things work, but also through technology, we want to control them, even militarily, right? And in other ways, of course, when you think of it in a global level, it becomes very evident. It's this attempt to have political control over the world, legal control, and so on. And the interesting thing is that now COVID is the kind of, I call it the monster of indisponibility, of non-controllability, right? It's like almost like like some could call it nature's revenge. I'm not sure whether it's nature's revenge, but it's the symbol, the manifestation of the fact that the world, that life can never be made completely controllable. But COVID, or the coronavirus, right, is the exact opposite of disponibility or of availability, attainability, accessibility. Why do I think so? Well, because we don't have before March, right? There was no scientific knowledge of it at all. We didn't know anything about the virus because it probably didn't even exist, at least not in the human habitat, right? And we have no medical control over it. So far, there's no vaccine, there's no medicine to cure it. It's uncontrollable, right? And of course, it's uncontrollable technologically, it's uncontrollable in its economic consequences, and it's uncontrollable politically. I mean, that's what politicians do, right? Or what we do as societies. We try to do everything we can to regain control, to make this thing, right, controllable, available, attainable, accessible, which means we need to understand it, we need to identify it in every single person, probably, right? We need to understand how it spreads and then gain a mastery over it, technical control, like epidemic control, political control, scientific control, and so on. But so far we experience it as the monster, as I call it, of indisponibility or uncontrollability of the thing which we cannot control. And actually this non-controllability has another side, which is very frightening to us, right? So the world is really changing in our everyday experience because the non-controllability, the indisponibility of the virus is also it's also something we experience on the individual level, because I cannot see it, I cannot hear it, I cannot smell it or touch it, I don't know where it is, right? That's a very frightening situation. But the idea is now, you know, I ask, how do we relate to the world? Also on an everyday level. I go out, I walk through the streets, and now it is the feeling there's something in the air which I cannot see, which I cannot hear, which I do not smell, which I cannot control, right? But which might be deadly or at least very dangerous to me, right? And as we've heard before, of course, the danger is that this thing might already be in your body, right? In the body of the stranger or the child next to me. It might be already in the body of my own child, or it might be in my own body. So I think on a very basic level of experiencing the world, of being to the world and of acting in the world, it has, of course, created a form of fear, which I would even call ontological insecurity, right? We cannot trust the stranger, we cannot trust even our neighbors, we cannot even trust our own bodies and our own forms of perception. And you can see it, you know, it's kind of manifested, it's symbolized, it becomes visible and it becomes visible and feelable now in the fact that you know, breathing actually is the most basic way of experiencing the world, of being in the world and to the world, because we breathe in the world and we breathe it out. And now we have to wear a mask between ourselves and the world, right? So that is really the symbol, the manifestation, the physical experience of I cannot trust the world outside, and I cannot even trust my own breath, right? It might be deadly or poisonous for the others. So I think there is a kind of a very deep insecurity, and of course you could call it fear. There's fear in the way I am in the world, and I'm not surprised that this fear also translates sometimes and somehow to the political level. Because if I cannot even trust my own perception, if I cannot trust my neighbors, why should I trust the government, particularly in a situation where science says, well, we don't know yet either, right? So I think there is, on the one hand, there is deep distrust. On the other hand, as some have mentioned in the discussion before, this might actually also be a situation when new trust and solidarity is born, because in a world which is completely regulated, as our world is, and routinized, for everything there is someone responsible. There is a rule or an administration which is responsible. But when things break down, the chains of interaction don't work anymore, the routines no longer work, then this might be the point where we start to rethink again. Let's do it together. Let's think of new ways how to deal with this, right? And the other big thing, which I find really interesting when you think of how do I experience the world, this Corona crisis, the COVID crisis, has for the first time in a long stretch of time created something like joint attention on an almost global level, right? People everywhere in the world, in China, in Japan, in the Ivory Coast, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Latin America, in Europe, they are all kind of focusing on this threat, on the invisible threat, right, of the COVID crisis. And it's even a kind of joint emotion because the reactions are very similar all over the world, right? There's on the one hand distrust. If I don't see it, maybe it's not even there. But there is also the idea of protecting yourself with a mask, social distancing, and so on. So maybe it's the birth of a period, or at least of a worldwide global awareness with joint attention and joint emotion and hopefully joint action. But how should we act? And I would like to finish, I have a few more minutes, I see, by telling you what I have in mind, namely that this situation of uncontrollability of the world, right, is something we experience on all other levels too. I believe this is the global crisis. I believe modernity, the social formation, I would call the modern social formation, is in a deep crisis because this program of making the world controllable, right, available, attainable, accessible, but commanding it, dominating it, controlling it, always has the flip side of breeding monsters of non-controllability. Let me give you a few very small examples. Like think of how we have come to acquire nuclear power, right? We have come to control matter from the inside. We can split the atom. That is increasing our power, almost making ourselves omnipotent. But this has created the monster of the nuclear explosion, of the bomb or the power station which is blowing up. So we feel totally powerless. It's a loss of total control. And I think this characterizes our situation in the natural sphere anyway. We have come to control nature on so many levels, right? We have explored it scientifically, but we can also, we extract it from the earth, right? And we control it and we use the forces of nature. But this creates the monster of the climate disaster, of global warming, where we feel completely powerless. I can't do anything, right? And I believe even politically, this is very relevant, right? Because the idea of democracy, global sovereignty, popular sovereignty is the idea that we, the people, have become kind of omnipotent. We can do everything politically. But the experience, for example, in the face of Brexit or so, is that we are powerless because the financial markets are too strong, or the global economy and so on. So it's always this kind of flip side of trying to be in control of everything and really getting a long way there, and then experiencing total powerlessness. And my final example is in our everyday private lives, we have the same experience. We have become almost omnipotent with a remote control in the smart home, let's say, right? So it's one click and it's getting very bright light in the room. It's one click and it's getting really warm, and it's one click and there is loud music. So, and I can even change the color. It's blue or green or whatever, purple, right? When with one click. So I'm kind of omnipotent. But if the battery fails or the electricity, somehow the system fails, I cannot open the window. I cannot close the door. I cannot turn off the radio, for example, right? I become totally powerlessness. So we talked about trust. And I believe what COVID might teach us it's philosophy, right? Is that there is two ways of trust. One element of trust is I am in control of everything. And I think this program fails. You cannot be in control of everything. And by the way, the disprivileged on a global level and in all of our societies, they know this very well. They are not so, in my experience, my observation, they are not that afraid of the COVID virus, because they have already learned, they had to learn that they cannot control their lives, right? While some on the upper levels, the global elites, they were still living on the illusion we can have everything under control. So now we realize I believe we realize it's a complete illusion to think you can control all the situations that can come to you. But of course, I'm not advocating the opposite, fatalism. I cannot control it anyway. But there is a different way of trust. It's not the self-efficacy in the sense I control everything. It's Tanella Boni has talked about that too, if I understood her correctly, saying that there is a different way of trusting, namely, I don't know what will come, what the world has in store for me. I don't know what will happen next, but I trust that I, together with others, will find an answer, that I can react to it and deal with the situation, right? So I really hope, my hope is that we as societies develop a new way of living and working in this world, developing self-efficacy in the sense of, let's deal with the problems that they are there. Let's try to find solutions, but on a pragmatic level, right? Listening and answering instead of dominating and controlling. That's what I want to do philosophically. And I still have some hope that COVID might help us to get there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hartmut. I really appreciate that. As you're talking, the thought that keeps coming to mind is the very famous line by Gramsci, that the trouble is that the old is dying and the new has not yet been born. And I was just wondering how that fits into your analysis and the current confusion we're having. It seems like part of the political failure to respond to this adequately is at least in part due to this refusal to let the old die, to continue to insist that we can live our lives as we've been living them. As opposed to creating new alternatives of living in the world and relating to each other and organizing society. So I was curious what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think you're completely right there. I mean, even though we somehow realized, actually, I mean, I think it's very important to keep in mind that the old normal, right, the state of the world or of our lives before COVID wasn't such a great state of affairs, right? The old normal was very problematic already, right, because of global warming issues, because of democratic failure issues, because of global injustice issues, right? But in a term of crisis like the one we have now, it seems like that most people really, and most politicians also, right, try to get back as fast as possible to the old normal, to a very problematic state. And of course, that is due to the reason that it's very hard to see what the new will be, right? I mean, that's this old discussion, whether we can see the shape of the new before we let the old die, right? What has to come first, right? And probably people don't want to let the old die to go away from the old normal if they don't see what the new normal could be. But I have some hope in Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, right? She has this conception of natality. She says, what is really the distinguishing feature of human beings is that we are not forced. We do not have to continue along the old or along the old tracks, right? But we have the capacity to let the new be born. But I think what we need to do to see the new being born is to give up this old, very problematic idea of trying to control everything.
Thank you. So a question from one of our participants is, has the pandemic slowed down the acceleration, or does it inevitably accelerate the global integration that comes with this acceleration?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, really, because I think it's obviously true that the pandemic did slow down the world. I mean, just on a physical material level, you could measure it even in geopolitics, right? The seismologists say that the movement over the earth, right, has kind of slowed down because up to 95% of the air traffic has slowed down, and more inner cities, during at least March and April, traffic has been down by up to 85%. And even now on German highways, for example, even though Germany does not have a complete lockdown, traffic is only up to about 50%. So it's a material and physical slowdown, which of course doesn't always feel good, right? I mean, if you're laid off, for example, if you're out of work, you're slowed down, but it's a dysfunctional slowdown. It's an enforced slowing down. But of course, what we have done is we have increased the speed on the digital level, like what we are doing right now. I mean, a bit later, directly after this conference, I will have to give a talk in Guadalajara in Mexico, in Mexico. So I could not have done that before. So there is digital acceleration while there is physical slowdown. And this is something that the French philosopher and sociologist Paul Virilio predicted actually in the 1980s. he said the end of this situation will be polar inertia or frenetic standstill. We will not move anymore, right? Because today I hardly move. I always have to look into the camera and speak into the tiny microphone. So I will not, physically, I'm totally slowed down, but digitally, I'm kind of spinning like mad around the world. So I think it's this dialectics, the split between the real physical movement and the digital movement has vastly increased. And we don't know what will come out yet, but I do think we also experience how important our physical experience is. So maybe the result will not be a complete digitalization of our world, but a heightened awareness of the fact that we are physical embodied beings.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope we don't move to an exclusively digital way of interacting. Although, like you, I'd never be able to do this were it not for this expansion of relating to one another digitally. We don't have any more questions currently from any of the participants. So I guess I will just ask you the questions that I have myself while I have the luxury and we have some more time. You talk about this notion of ontological insecurity. And I'm curious if you could maybe flesh that out a little bit more and how COVID has not so much changed the nature of our insecurity, but made all of us sort of aware of the fact that that exists.
Yeah, I mean, I take the concept of ontological security from Anthony Giddens, right? But it's also... Okay, so it's around in philosophy in different ways, and the idea is just that there is a basic level of trust that for example the earth under my feet will not open up and kind of suck me in or so, right? And of course, part of this, there are some things which we just trust, and of course one of the things we always trusted is that we can breathe the air freely, right, without worrying that we poison ourselves through this. And normally, if you meet someone, if someone says, oh, hello, or if you kind of embrace your friends, you normally, it's kind of ontological security. He will not kill me, for example, right, if you embrace someone. And so if all of a sudden these kind of things you were always secure about, right, become highly risky, potentially deadly, right, then your basic relationship towards the world is changing. And I think, and you're right, I mean, my claim was, I mean, look at something, if you think of something like the European Union, right, we kind of, and many aspects of the political world, for example, that we are moving towards free markets, right, they were just taken for granted. And then someone like Donald Trump comes along and he just imposes new tariffs, right, on trades or so, and he just leaves, he just cancels legal international treaties and so on. So things which were absolutely taken for granted, which we did not even think about, all of a sudden become questionable. You can no longer be sure that you will not have a bomb on your head or so. I mean, many people will tell you that was always their everyday experience. But so far we thought these forms of insecurity, when you cannot be sure whether you will die by a bomb or by a virus tomorrow, right, should be something that we can systematically overcome, right? It's only something that we have to deal with on the fringes of society. And now we all of a sudden realize, I mean, it's the most drastic experience we maybe can have of it, that life is in a certain sense always uncontrollable, right? So my hope is that we gain a kind of, let's call it second order ontological security, right? That I no longer believe I'm in control of everything, but that I have the feeling that even though I do not know what will happen next, right? Or at least I'm aware that things can always change. I trust in my own capacity, but also, of course, in our collective, because we can only do this together, in our collective capacity to find answers and react to this.
So then would you agree then with Tanella, Boni, that Seneca and the Stoics can provide some useful guidance in navigating our way forward through here, or would you object to that?
No, I think it might certainly be an interesting way of going back to the antiquity and those philosophers. But as I said before, I mean, my idea is the conception I developed is a conception of being in resonance with the world, and I think that's not exactly Seneca's or the Stoics' idea, because being in resonance means, what I really want to say is, let's not try to control and dominate the world. Let's try to listen and respond. But in our response, there is also a sense of self-efficacy. Yes, we can do something. We have resources to live on, right? We are not condemned to fatally live with what is coming to us, but we develop a sense of actually also increasing our capacity to listen to not just to other beings, but to nature, to history, for example, right? To things, and then being with them together, but not just in a passive way. Let's do what nature tells us, but let's be in a kind of dialogue with each other and the world. So I think it's not exactly the Seneca and the Stoics approach, but we can certainly get inspiration from them.
So would your sense of being in resonance with the world, it sounds like that would entail an entire rethinking of how humans understand their position in the world and what the world exists for. You mentioned both climate change and COVID, and these seem to be responses to human insistence that the world is for us, to be used for us. There's very much the sense in which one could understand the world is saying, like, no, this is not working. This is detrimental. And so does your sense of being in resonance with the world sort of compel us to reevaluate where we understand ourselves to be in terms of global importance?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I really, what I'm trying to get at is a different way of, it's a different social formation really, but it's very important to see that it's not just a change in philosophical position or our individual habitus, right? Because of course it is also, it's tightly connected to the institutional framework and fabric of modernity, and with what you can call capitalism, for example, capitalist markets, because in our current economic system, there is this need to speed up, to grow, to increase control and domination over the world, just in order to keep up our institutional status quo, right? Otherwise, we lose jobs. We cannot pay the taxes, the pensions. We cannot entertain or maintain the health systems, and so on. So I think the whole logic, not just the philosophy of modernity, but the whole institutional logic is geared towards. It's created in the way of trying to gain control and being forced to permanently increase our hold over the world. So I believe modernity is in a very deep crisis, and we need to rethink our formation on an institutional level, somehow to overcome this logic, of a capitalist society driven by financial markets, right? Because they force us to speed up, to optimize in all respects, and to always achieve growth and innovation at all costs. This is what creates the position you just said it doesn't work. You're right? The world is telling us, well, this attempt of gaining complete control and always using everything to our individual purposes seems to not work. So we need an institutional and a cultural change. And of course, it's a long way to get there, but maybe something good comes out of this crisis and we make some progress.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, so I'm going to read one that came through the Q&A. And we're asked, do you think that based on the fact that we cannot trust our own basic sense to make sense of our world, this situation might teach us in some way that we have to cope with or solve the ecological urgency, the air pollution, for example, that is almost 100% invisible to us for now? Or are we doomed to stay blind to the underlying problems of disease related to the environment? Is the fight against the virus also a fight against absurdity, against the nonsense of the virus? Our being in the world and also our search for sense and the mere existence of the virus, is this a questioning of our existence?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, right? I think it's a questioning of our existence, but the question is on what level. And I'm as I said before, I'm inclined to say it's a questioning of our current, what I call modern way of being in the world, right? And maybe, I was in France actually at a philosophy conference also with Bruno Latour, and there some biologists tried to combine that with philosophical thinking from a Chinese tradition, and their idea was that the virus actually, because it's not a living thing, it's not a bacterium, right? They cannot reproduce themselves, so it's very unclear what a virus is. And the idea was that the virus actually is an indicator of a distortion in our way of being in the world and relating to the world. So I think, yes, I'm almost inclined to read it as a sign of this distortion, which is also, of course, connected to global warming and the other, our ecological disaster. And I think since the virus forces us to really act, right, we might gain, that's my big hope, because, you know, normally when you think of, for example, there are always more and more airplanes, more and more cars, more and more trucks, on more and more ships every year. If you look at the 200 years in the past, every year, no matter how many climate accords there were struck, right, there were more cars, more planes, more trains, more ships, cruise ships, container ships, bigger ships, and so on. And actually our feeling was there's nothing we can do against it, right? We can talk about it, we can write books, we can have Fridays for Future protestations, but in fact, nothing changes. But now actually the COVID crisis has proven that politics is capable of bringing down 95% of airplanes within a few days. It was not the virus who brought them down, it was political action in the face of a crisis. So I think we also got some experience of political self-efficacy, and we might very well be able to use this in order to deal with the global climate crisis and other crises as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That brings us exactly to time. So I want to introduce our last speaker. Our last speaker is Julian Baggini. Julian Baggini is a British philosopher, journalist, and author of over 20 books on philosophy written for the general public. He is co-founder of the Philosophers magazine and has written for numerous international newspapers and magazines. In addition to writing on the theme of philosophy, he has also written books on atheism, secularism, and the nature of national identity. He is also a patron of Humanists UK. Julian, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, and thank you to UNESCO for inviting me. It's been a very interesting discussion so far. I hope I can add something to it. I want to talk about, and I've got some slides to show, so you don't have to look at me too much throughout this, and I think we can perhaps put the first one up, and I'll have to instruct when to go through, I believe. So do we have the first slide up? I can't see that. Okay. Well, I'll talk, and then whoever's doing the slides can perhaps try and catch up with me. I was going to begin by just talking about risk. I think that what I'm going to be talking about in this brief time is what this pandemic, I think, tells us about the limits of human rationality and perhaps the mistakes we make about how reason works and how rational persuasion ought to work. And what I really wanted to start with was this idea that one thing that's very clear is we're not very good at risk perception. Okay, so you can always see this in newspaper articles, magazine articles all the time, which are giving these headlines like why you're probably not so great at risk assessment. This is the next slide. Why human brains are bad at assessing the risks of pandemics. And you see these in things like the New York Times, the Washington Post, as well as more specialist publications like Psychology Today and Psych Central. So, I mean, and that's kind of something that we just now, I think, accept about ourselves. We've learned we're very, very bad risk assessors. That can lead people to take excessive risks, for sure. It can encourage people to behave in ways that they shouldn't do because they don't understand the risks of going out without masks and so forth. But as a slide after this shows, it can also lead us to underestimate risks. So there was this story here, just a little silly story really, from a British newspaper called The Metro, in which there's a beachgoer who says, oh, I don't know anyone who's had coronavirus, so it doesn't matter. You know, that idea that we assess the risk not from any kind of objective, rational assessment of what's going on, but how things seem to us. And this is the next slide. And that therefore, if we don't see something bad going on, we're not very afraid of it, which is why, going back to something said previously, a pandemic can bring the planes down from the sky because the risk is immediate and evident, whereas actually, climate change, where it's much, much more important because we don't perceive the risks so directly and so emotionally, nothing is done about them. So our assessment of risk is very poor, but also associated with that, hope. We're not very good at hope. So let's take this very famous quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, we should act without hope. And what he meant was not that we should be absolute pessimists and expect anything not to work. It was simply the idea that actually when we set about trying to achieve some good, we don't know whether we're going to succeed. And that to act without hope is to act trying to bring about what we want to bring about, but without necessarily expecting that it will. I only know that whatever may be in my power to make it so, I shall do. Beyond that, I can count upon nothing. This is a realistic view of hope, I think, but there are unrealistic views of hope, as the next slide unfortunately illustrates. The soon-to-be previous president of the United States, Donald Trump, famously has encouraged a kind of empty hope based not on reason at all, with his pronouncements such as, one day it's like a miracle, it will disappear, it's going away, we have it totally under control. These are things he said repeatedly, and that kind of like false hope. Why does that appeal to people? Well, I mean, one reason is, of course, hope is pleasant, it's nice to have it, but also, we're just not very good at working out what is likely and unlikely to happen. So we're likely to go with our feelings, not with our rational judgment. And this is deeply problematic. So when you put these two things together, if you think about how people think about hope and risk, and you think about how bad we are at both of those things, you can end up with a very pessimistic conclusion. The next slide will give an example of that. Jonathan Swift said on more than one occasion a few things which were very pessimistic about reason. Reasoning will never make a man correct an ill opinion which by reasoning he never acquired. In other words, if the hopes and the fears we have do not have their roots in any kind of rational assessment, how can we hope for any kind of rationality to make us correct those things? And as he also said very memorably, reason is a very light rider and easily shook off. So I think the pandemic would seem to underline something which is repeatedly being said by experts, and it's becoming a kind of new common sense that human beings are not rational, and it is really beyond our capacity to correct our behaviors and attitudes by the use of reason. And if you're a philosopher and you value reason, that's not a very cheerful proposition. But I think that reflecting on this is not a reason to give up on reason, on rationality. It's rather an opportunity to reflect a little more about what it actually means to reason, and in particular, what it means to reason publicly, what it means to reason in such a way as to persuade people of things that are true, rather than to persuade them of the things that you want them to believe. My next slide shows Aristotle. Aristotle was, of course, one of the founding fathers of Western philosophy, and he described very famously the principles of rhetoric. And these are going to appear as each click of the mouse comes up. First, logos. So this is the idea of reason. Logos is reason, that a good argument should be rooted in reason. But that wasn't the end of it. As a philosopher, he was not so naive as to think that persuasion only requires logos, reason. It requires two other things. The first is pathos, emotion. To persuade, you need to also connect with people's feelings. Now, this is very interesting because the way in which psychologists today talk about the human mind and human behavior, it would be easy to think that actually reason and feeling operate in parallel and they're unconnected. If you think about system 1 and system 2 thinking in the work of Daniel Kahneman, this has become very, very well known. The idea is that we have quick, hot emotional responses, and we have slow, cold, rational responses. And it's like these two systems are completely separate. Well, Kahneman himself doesn't actually say they're completely separate, but that's the kind of message which has come through. I think what we appreciate actually is that these things do affect one another. How you feel affects the way you think. How you think changes the way you feel. So, for example, how afraid we are does depend on what we believe to be true about the thing we're afraid of. But it can work the other way too. So, rational persuasion, rational argument, needs to connect reason and feeling, and it can do that when it's done best. The third element is ethos, and this is extremely important. In order to be persuaded, we need to have a certain trust in the character of the person who is trying to persuade us. This isn't irrelevant. In the kind of philosophy I was trained in, we were told to ignore the philosopher, if you like, ignore the person. To criticize a position, or for that reason to give it merit on the basis of who said it, was known as the ad hominem fallacy. Well, actually, I think that's rather naive. In a pure state, of course, such as you find perhaps in science, then maybe there are occasions where you can completely disregard the nature of the speaker. In real life, the nature of the speaker is very important, because reason, even evidence, these are things which can be manipulated. A very clever person can come up with a very clever argument for something which suits their own interests. What you want to know is not only that the person is so clever that they can make something look persuasive, but that they are sincere and honest and have integrity. This is a perfectly reasonable thing to take into account when assessing the reasonableness of arguments. Now, the next slide, I'm going to show how these three principles of ethos and logos and pathos interact. And this is a way of sort of identifying a problem, but also perhaps a solution. So there are various people whose pictures will appear as the mouse is clicked. Maybe we can have the first click or two. So I think that on the positive side, we have people like, I think, Barack Obama and Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand premier, who exemplify that kind of how this can still work. What Aristotle said was still true. You can have people who are seen as being of good character and integrity. They're also based their, what they say, on reason and argument, but they also have a way to connect with people emotionally. And these are inspirational. And the fact that such people do exist in our politics is a cause for hope. On the other hand, if we can see the next person to appear, there are people who appear simply to be effective because they appeal to pathos. And I'm looking at you, Donald Trump. It may appear to be that Trump is persuasive, but it can't be because of the rationality of his arguments, because I don't think it's controversial to say there is no rationality to his arguments. But he has a way of connecting with people's emotions, their fears in particular. He really does seize on people's fears. However, I think that actually what should disturb us is not so much that Trump's appeal is based purely on pathos. If we can see the next two people to appear in this diagram, Trump, I think, could also be placed in the intersection of ethos and pathos, along with perhaps Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. This is not to say that I believe these people are of good character and that's why they can be trusted. But there's a significant number of people who now believe that the virtues of character that are required to lead a nation are the kind of virtues they see in Trump and Bolsonaro. The virtues of being iconoclastic against the establishment, independent-minded, perhaps they might be seen. So it's extremely worrying, in fact, that a large proportion of the population seem to believe that these people represent good character. If we may have another 2 clicks. So the first click will show Trump next to Bolsonaro, the next advance, and one more click will show this figure of the academic. Now, this is a caricature. Unfortunately, I think this is part of our problem. The academic, the scientist, the philosopher, they're seen as representing logos, and logos in this view is distinct from, it's certainly nothing to do with pathos. There is an inability of academic study to appeal to people on an emotional level. But I also think there is a distrust. People do not no longer trust the characters of academics. They believe they are a part of a self-serving liberal elite, that they are furthering their own interests, and there's a lack of trust in their character. So what are we to do about this? Well, I think fortunately the solution's quite simple to describe, difficult to bring about. So the next slide simply shows us a little summary of what the current image of the intellectual and the academic is. And in analytic philosophy, which is dominant in a lot of the English-speaking world, you have these diagrams as well. If we could go forward rather than back, that'd be great. And I think this is the problem. Reason, this is the image people have of reason and rationality. It's one where those other elements of ethos, of character, and of passion, of emotion, have been separated from it. And I think that's a key part of why it is not working, and why people find it so difficult to enable to convey truthful messages which give an accurate idea of fear and risk and hope in ways that people understand. But there is hope, and my final slide perhaps will show this, illustrate this. The final slide is a representation of an Enlightenment salon in Paris, where UNESCO is based. This is the salon of Madame Boufflers, who the great Enlightenment thinkers all went to her home. They loved it. And Hume was a visitor there in late life. And the image of the salon is one of a humane reason. It's also about civility. It's about enjoyment. It's about pleasure, and it's about conviviality. And Hume, who attended these, famously said, "Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, still be a man." We would hope that today he would say, still be a human being, rather than give us that gendered man. But this is, I think, what the pandemic is telling us about how academics and philosophy needs to recast itself to be of a benefit to the world. It needs to shatter and to challenge the image it has of a detached enterprise conducted by people who have no concern other than for their own careers and their own professional development. I don't think this is accurate, but I don't think the academy has been successful so far in correcting that image. And if we can do that, if we can find ways to speak to people in which reason is supplemented both by that demonstration of character and also can connect with people's feeling, then I think there is hope that despite all we are told, people can have a more rational assessment of what they should be afraid of, what the risks are, and also what they can hope for. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Julian. As someone with a background in analytic philosophy as well, I'm familiar with what you're talking about, that insistence to write and communicate in a way that is sort of cold and dispassionate and removed from our emotions. But you mentioned Hume at the end, who argues that we need to treat emotions almost as though they're sort of facts about our existence. But what are some ways that we can sort of bridge this gap? While you were talking, I was thinking about how this related to the nature of the free speech debate and the limitations of rationality and making sense of that. I'm here in the US, where we're handling the COVID pandemic in just about the worst way possible. And people will insist with absolute conviction that masks makes no difference. And in fact, they will actually kill you because they limit your ability to breathe in oxygen. And so how do we make headway here when emotions can become so salient that they override facts and reason? And how do we strike that right balance by recognizing that there are these intense emotional responses but that are divorced from anything that we could plausibly call rationality?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a good question. I said it in a sense, the general direction is simple enough to describe. How to achieve it is very, very difficult. And and one of the reasons it's difficult is it requires shifting a set of perceptions that have become quite deeply embedded. I think what you need to do is to ask, why are people so resistant to these rational messages? And I think there are two answers to that, which are popular and not helpful. One is simply that human beings are stupid. The problem with this is that a lot of people who say that do not believe that they are stupid, of course. And the fact that human beings are stupid does not explain why only half the population supports one proposition, which is supposedly stupid, and not the other half. The other is that those people who disagree are, to use that unfortunate phrase, the deplorables. You know, the people who refuse to respond to what educated opinion says is the rational thing are just sort of somehow second-class citizens or inferior. So I think you have to start by recognizing that people, there's something called the principle of charity in argument, which I think is really important, which is that you should always try and interpret the beliefs and arguments and actions of others in ways which make most sense and not least sense. So you ask, why would someone who is no more stupid than the average human being reach silly conclusions? And I think you have to recognize there are certain answers to that. One is that they do not believe these academics and experts are people who have their own interests in heart, other people's interests at heart. They think they are self-serving. The second, and that is shown by the fact that when they talk to them, they often do talk to them in patronizing ways, as though the people won't understand. And the other reason is that to the extent that people do have emotions and feelings here, they're not taken seriously. So, I mean, for example, if we take the case of in North America, I personally believe, and not everyone at this event will agree, I personally believe that a lot of what Donald Trump has argued for has no basis around economic policy. But you speak to people, you hear people who are from those, the Rust Belt, or these former industrial places, and it is entirely reasonable that they have a fear that their jobs have gone, that imports will kill them, and that there is nothing else to do other than to try and revive these old industries. If you don't understand that fear, then you can't engage with them rationally. So I've sketched out a few things here, but I think it's really, in a way, it's simple. You have to understand how it's not enough just to sort of talk to people as you would talk to them in a seminar. You have to recognize, as Aristotle saw, that people have to recognize you as being of someone they can trust. And you also have to understand how they're feeling and speak to that as well. And it can be done. And this is why I had the hope of people like Obama and Arden in the political realm. They show it can be done.
Thank you. Are there philosophers that you're familiar with who you think are doing this sort of work well and can serve as a model for the rest of us who might like to improve?
Well, I think there are. It's difficult to name names. I mean, I think in particular, I have to say I'm encouraged by a younger generation of philosophers. When I started in philosophy, I think the general ethos was still quite a detached one. It was, many people had no interest in talking to the general public at all. And if they did, it was in a somewhat superior manner. I think the younger generation are very different. And I'll just mention one person because they're at the front of my mind, Misha Cherry, who's an American philosopher. She's giving a talk for us in the UK, the Royal Institute of Philosophy, again online, so anyone can watch it later. And I've seen her talk before, and I've seen other things she's done. And I think that she writes and talks about very difficult issues around things like race and gender, the kind of issues which are very divisive. but she does so in a way which I think it really sort of shows an understanding. You know, it's not about just telling people why they're wrong. It is about understanding. And so it's that combination, her manner and the content of what she's saying and the way she conducts herself, which is with civility and respect to other people, means she's someone who I think that anyone, I mean, a lot of people, of course, just wouldn't choose to listen to her because they've already decided she's an opponent. But if they did, they would discover that not everyone who is arguing in favor of things like critical race theory despises white working class men or wants to take away their culture and tradition, you know. So I think she's a very good example.
Yeah, I would second that. I've assigned her this semester and I've had some pretty great success. That wraps up my question. Is there anything else you'd like to use the last few minutes to cover or direct our attention to that you think might be of some use in helping us make more rational sense of this topsy-turvy world that we're inhabiting?
Okay, well, I think one thing that perhaps, again, academic life is slowly coming around to, I don't want to be too critical, by the way, of academic life. It's very fashionable to criticize academics. But the institutions of academic life over the past century have encouraged, I think, excessive specialization. And specialization is very important sometimes, and you do need specialists. But in the ecosystem of academia, I think the problem is it's too much focused on specialists and not on people who can bring things together. I think that when it comes to any issue of public importance and practical effect, you always need a variety of expertises. I mean, in some ways, I would say that actually, something said right at the beginning by Tanella, which was about the idea of the relationality of human beings. That's a kind of something I've become much more aware of in recent years, that the archetypal Western thinker is the solitary thinker. It's Descartes' meditations alone in his room. It's Rodin's statue like this. Whereas actually thinking is something which is at its most successful when it's collaborative. It requires bringing people together. And I think that when people are skeptical of expertise, which they often are, in some ways they're kind of right, in the sense that when a single individual or even a single discipline claims for itself expertise over matters which have wide social concern, that's almost invariably wrong. The true expert is really a collective. You know, to solve this pandemic problem, you need to bring together individuals with different specialisms and combine their expertise. Something it sounds like Joe Biden is trying to do in the States, and hopefully will be successful in. So I think it's about trying to facilitate that kind of cross-fertilization, and not just deepening our knowledge in particular areas, but trying to work out how to bring these things most fruitfully together. And if you think about it, I mean, do you know of any major academic institution which has what you might call a professor of synoptic studies, someone whose only job it is to kind of join the dots between the different expertises in universities? I don't know of one. I think every department, every university should have dozens of them, actually, because without them, there's just a lot of knowledge which is being lost because it's only being heard within the discipline. So I think that's a big, big challenge for academic and scholarly life.
Well, to answer your question, no, I am not familiar with a university that has such a department. But I just want to thank you again for participating, and Tanella and Luke and Hartmut. We are just about out of time. And so again, thank you to everyone for participating and spending your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be time zone with us today.
Big thank you from UNESCO
Thanks a
also
lot.
to all of you. Merci beaucoup d'avoir contribué ainsi à la Journée mondiale de la philosophie à l'UNESCO. Many thanks.
Thank you. Merci.
Thank you.
Merci
beaucoup.
beaucoup.
Dankeschön.
Merci bien.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Merci. Au revoir.
Bye bye.